big deal about CETA is that it was negotiated in secret between the EU and Canada, that it represents the interest of big business and is set to undermine our democracy and destroy our basic rights. The big deal about CETA is that no MPs or MEPs were allowed to take part in the talks, which took place in secret, and no one was granted access to the text of the agreement until it was too late. The big deal about CETA is that Fine Gael MEPs in particular refused to debate it, and Fianna Fáil is keeping its head buried in the sand. This is why we urgently need to stop CETA now, before it is too late.
During the trade negotiations between the EU and Canada, IFA identified the concerns that it had in relation to the concession of large volumes of tariff-free quota, particularly for the vulnerable, or the very important but vulnerable beef sector, and for the pig meat sector. The volume of TRQ that has been allocated to Canada in this trade deal will be brought in over a period of years. Our concern remains that the Canadians will target the high value market and that this will have a depressing impact on prices in the beef sector and pig meat sector. Our main concern in relation to CETA, though, however, is in relation to future trade deals. The large amount of quota that has been conceded must be taken into account in any other discussions that the EU has, in particularly, for example, with the United States. And on the other hand, there has to be recognition of the fact that the EU-Canadian trade deal provides the potential for increased market access for our dairy exports.
My name is Frank Keoghan and I'm speaking on CETA, What's the Big Deal, on behalf of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions' position on CETA is unambiguous. It is a position of outright opposition. And that's the actual words that were used in the resolution before our biennial delegate conference, which rejected both CETA and TTIP. Our concerns, as with most of those who are campaigning against these deals, are primarily with ISDS provisions, or ICS, depending on the agreement, but also our concerns embrace those of environmentalists, farmers, those who are concerned about chemicals, etc.
You're meeting this evening to discuss CETA, the Canadian trade deal. One of the things I've noticed in the debate up to now is that on one side you have those who support the deal saying it's brilliant, it's everything we could have ever wanted, it will bring jobs, it will bring prosperity, etc. And then on the other side you have people saying absolutely not, it's the worst possible trade deal, we need to get rid of it, and we need to get rid of it now. For me personally, I won't say necessarily in the middle, but I have a slightly more nuanced view of it. There's good and bad in CETA. This is liberalism on steroids, and I believe that down the line, a number of member states will look at this, especially if they don't have Liberal governments, and ask, how did this happen? Well, it's happening now.
CETA is the EU-Canadian trade deal. Many of you won't have heard of it because it's been negotiated in secret, and governments and the European Commission have been doing everything in their power to make sure that people aren't aware of it, but it could have very dangerous consequences. So what's the big deal? The big deal is that it includes an investment court. That's something that will allow multinational corporations to sue governments for enacting progressive legislation. It also includes very dangerous provisions that could detrimentally affect many key sectors of the Irish economy, particularly agriculture. Now, the reason why we're raising this issue now is because a key vote is going to be coming up in the European Parliament in early February. We need you to ensure that you engage with MEPs. Sinn Féin MEPs will be to the forefront, as we have been from the start, in opposing this dangerous trade deal, but we need other MEPs to follow suit. So we need your help in ensuring that we put pressure on Fine Gael MEPs in particular and on the Irish government to stand up for Irish interests and oppose CETA.
CETA, what's the big deal? If this agreement is good for us, then why the secrecy? Why the strong-arm tactics of the EU towards the people of this region, Wallonia? Harmonisation of standards means a race towards the lowest common denominator. Everything from food quality to working conditions will be affected. The argument that it won't affect public services is incorrect. Already privatised services will be difficult, if not impossible, to renationalise under CETA. Written for and by big business behind closed doors with built-in private court system loaded in favour of multinationals. When they talk about increased competition, what they mean is increased stress on populations both sides of the Atlantic, increased despair, followed by the inevitable increase in mental health problems. Say no to CETA. There is no going back. It'll be too late if you don't stop it now.
Welcome. Anna Clavin here at Outtake Community Media. Today we are discussing CETA, what's the big deal? And in studio we have Attracta Ivrin representing the environmental pillar, Seamus Butler, a manufacturer here in Longford and also county councillor, Shane O'Brien, who's a county councillor from Dunleary, Rathdown, Seamus May, representing the International Small Business Alliance, and Patrick Kent, President of the ICSA, which is the farm body representing beef and sheep farmers. Attracta, if I could begin with you, can you tell me what is the environmental pillar?
The environmental pillar is simply a coalition of 28 national NGOs who work together to advocate on issues of concern to the environment. So it includes groups like a lot of your listeners would be maybe members of, like Birdwatch Ireland, Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, An Taisce, etc. Okay.
Right. Attracta, many people watching the introduction to the programme will have learned by now that CETA is a trade deal between the EU and Canada, and they're about to switch off. Why is it important for them to keep watching?
Yes, I mean, I'd probably be in the same boat because a lot of people think about trade as being sort of boring and containers sitting on the quays. But CETA is quite different. It stands for Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, and it's one of a number of trade deals that the EU is negotiating. And, you know, in a small economy like Ireland, an open economy, we know that trade is actually really important. So that's one of the reasons why people should be interested. But the second one is that there are very deep concerns about some aspects of the CETA. It is, I suppose, in the first instance, it's real. You know, there's 1,598 pages of the agreement. That's roughly half of it, which represents the most of the agreement. And the other sort of 7,500 pages is annexes representing what has been excluded from the agreement, I think is the easiest and simplest way of putting it. And I suppose that's really important because in terms of the services that are encompassed within the CETA, it's everything unless you've specifically excluded it. And very few people, if anybody in Ireland, knows actually what Ireland has chosen to protect. And that's one of the big reasons that a lot of people are concerned, because there's been no consultation about what we have excluded from the very significant and profound changes and exposure that there will be to Irish businesses and Irish services consequent on the competition that will arise from the CETA. And the second thing that people are very concerned about is the profound transfer of power that it gives to big business interests over the interests of citizens and indeed governments. And that we can talk a little bit about later, perhaps.
So, Attractor, would it be true to say that this is a potential loss of our sovereignty?
I think that's a very good way of putting it, to be honest, because it's quite significant in two respects in terms of how it impacts upon our sovereignty. There is this concept of what they call regulatory convergence and regulatory cooperation. So where you want to trade, you want to try and equalise standards on either side of the trading partners. That in general doesn't sound necessarily like a bad idea, but the concern is that that will actually pull good EU standards down and back. And we've actually seen that already in terms of the way Canada effectively lobbied on a new fuel directive. It spent 35 million influencing a new fuel directive so that the tar sands wouldn't need to be labelled in a way which would highlight how problematic they are from an environmental perspective. So there will be councils where there will be oversight of and a requirement to notify when new regulations are being brought in, and how that will effectively compromise progressive regulation is a big concern. The second aspect is, and it's quite a notorious element, is an investment arbitration mechanism. It's known in the CETA as ICS, the investor court system, but it's not like a court like you and I would talk about, a court where you have equality before the law and where you have independence of judges. This is a panel of 15 arbitrators who will be assigned to adjudicate on cases where big business has decided to sue governments for introducing regulations and policies which impact upon their profitability. Now, that's a very real thing, because Lone Pines sue the state of Quebec for $250 million for introducing regulations on fracking. We're very conscious here that we've introduced some really progressive regulation in relation to smoking, the smoking ban, cigarette packaging, notifications on the health impacts. And Philip Morris, a very big tobacco company, sued Uruguay, not because it was a big market share, but because Uruguay was actually leading the charge in terms of progressive regulation on smoking issues. And even though it wasn't successful in suing it, the effect of that meant that governments became fearful of introducing regulation for the fear that big tobacco would come after them. And it's that mechanism that basically that takes away, even though CETA says you have the right to regulate, it's in there in black and white, but the practical effect of it is that governments become fearful of regulating. And in that way, we have compromised significantly, as you've put it, our sovereignty in terms of what we want to do in our citizens' interests. And that's a huge, huge issue with the CETA.
Okay, Attractor, we'll come back to some of those issues that you have raised later on in the discussion. Councillor Seamus Butler, you are head of the majority in Longford County Council, but you also have a business here in Longford. Can you tell us a little bit about your business?
Yes, Anna, my day job, if you want, is Butler Manufacturing Services Limited on the Strokestown Road in Longford, and we're trading for 30 years this year. And we've exported, we have product in over 40 countries around the world. And one of those countries happens to be Canada. Right. And in fact, this year alone, we sent one of our packaged sewage treatment plants out to Newfoundland. And I'm a director and shareholder in a company in Newfoundland, in Canada. And I'm one of those boring people that put stuff in the containers you were talking about that go into ports. And from that point of view, I believe in trade agreements because most of our exports go to Europe. In France, our product is known as Le Shannon, and we ship that from Longford. We design it, manufacture it, and ship it here from Longford to France and to French territories. And Canada is a market we're trying to build on. Originally, we licensed our product there. That didn't work out. So now we're selling product that employs people here in Longford. And now, because we're an environmental product, it doesn't directly affect us because the tariffs at the moment are much lower. They used to be about 22%, and it made life very difficult for us. in this, I believe that we are in a worldwide market. And one of the things we have to grow, we have foreign direct investment. And as we've seen in Longford, when the decisions are made in Paris or Frankfurt or somewhere like that, you have no say and the jobs go. 99% plus of all companies in this country are SMEs, and we're an SME.
Yes.
And we have to let those SMEs grow. And the Irish market, we were always taught in the IMI, the Irish market is about the same size as Greater Manchester. Now, when you're in the sort of product we are, you'll soon fill the market. The market isn't sustainable. You have to look outside, which we did right from the start. And unless we build SMEs that can export around the world, and anything that benefits that, there are points in that. I'm not an expert on CETA by any manner or means, and I do object to multinationals because I'm an SME and I've been victims of them. But the minutiae, it's up to our people in Brussels and wherever to ensure that they protect what is already there. But we must grow and we must look beyond our own horizons. I think for too long in Ireland we looked inwards. We've shipped as far away as Australia. This year alone we shipped to the Caribbean, to Montserrat, which is actually called the Emerald Isle. We've shipped to Guadeloupe, and we shipped to the Central African Republic from a plant just on the outskirts of Longford on the Strokestown Road. And anything that encourages that sort of international trade, yes, there's always threats. Globalization is a threat. But we've globalised as an SME here in Longford in Ireland. So what's wrong with that?
Well, I have to say that that's a wonderful story and you're given great employment. In practical terms, if tariffs are removed, how will that improve the cash flow of your business?
Well, for example, if you import materials from outside the EU at the moment, you have to pay VAT up front on those goods. And it could be a sizable amount at 23% or whatever, and you don't get that back until about 2 to 3 months later. So for smaller companies, cash flow is king. More companies actually go out of business because they run out of cash rather than being inherently unprofitable. And in that respect, we would understand under this that if we import raw materials from Canada, now it mightn't necessarily apply to butler manufacturing, but it might to other companies, is that we won't have that arrangement. It'll be as the EU is at the moment. If we import anything from the EU, we don't have to pay the VAT up front or anything like that. And similarly with our exports.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll come back to some of those points again.
I'm sure we will.
Yes. Shane, it's great to have you. You're a very young person. It's wonderful to see the views of a young person represented here today. But you're a Sinn Féin councillor in Dunleary Rathdown, and I know that your party, Sinn Féin, have taken a very strong stand against CETA, you're just back from Brussels.
Yeah, I was actually over in Brussels last week, and I've been working for a number of years with our MEP Matt Carty on the issue of trade, and specifically CETA also. And we have taken a very strong stance against CETA for many of the reasons that Attracta has just outlined, and even the point you made yourself in the loss of sovereignty, which is actually, you could say, a surrendering rather than a loss, because we are choosing, or our government is choosing, to hand over these powers and erode basic human rights in spite of what all the data and the analysis shows of what effect this deal will have on the various sectors in Ireland, including SMEs, including the environment, and including our future ability to regulate and to create policy which is in the best interests of the citizens we represent. Obviously, CETA, I think, is it's a text which has been agreed, and that's what makes it different than a number of the other trade deals that have been talked about, and in some ways have received a lot more attention, such as TTIP or TPP, the agreement between the US and Pacific regions. But I think in CETA itself, and that's the key issue which I think we need to talk about this evening, is the ICS, or which formerly known as the ISDS. And it is a paralegal system which we do not have access to as citizens, and is only available for transnational and multinational corporations to use to you could say, to frighten or to create a regulatory chill to ward off governments from introducing measures which not only affect their profits but may affect their profits into the future. And to call it even a court, I think goes against what actually the definition of a court and the justice system allows for. I think in relation to CETA and just on the point of trade, I must be very clear that Sinn Féin isn't against trade. This is about the type of trade we want and how we also negotiate these agreements. For 8 years, the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU, has been basically negotiated behind closed doors in secrecy and without any meaningful public consultation. And even when there has been consultation on some aspects of the deal, that consultation or the submissions from the greater public across Europe has been ignored. Let's take the instance of the ISDS. 95% of all public submissions on the ISDS clause were actually rejected. They rejected the notion or the concept that we should have a paralegal system which is only accessible to multinationals. They rejected that idea. However, instead of taking that out of the agreement, what the EU Commission did was rebrand it. And they took out the name ISDS and they changed it to ISCS. So that's not meaningful public consultation, and it is, it's not good enough in terms of negotiating trade deals. And now, on the point of just the adoption of the deal, and that's what's so great about your media outlet covering this tonight. There has been no real debate on this issue, and that's why I'm really pleased to be here this evening. Yes, and we'll come back to that point later on. Seamus, you too are in business. You are the chairperson of the International Small Business Alliance. Do you share Seamus Butler's view on CETA?
Well, so far I'm sharing everybody's view, really. First and foremost, obviously, as a business person, we can't be against trade, and we're not. And I certainly would commend Seamus on his tremendous business. But the problem with CETA and these other similar trades is these are being called trade deals and free trade deals. And to be perfectly honest, they have very little to do with free trade or trade deals. Anybody that could possibly describe a trade deal or a free trade deal that includes ISDS or ICS as they're now called, basically, let's not put a tooth in it, they're kangaroo courts organised by global corporations. And we, the citizens, have to pay, and small business and farmers. We all have to pay for them. But CETA and similar deals just haven't appeared overnight. We have to go back to say we're all Europeans and we're all part of the European Union. And I first started going and doing some work in the European Parliament longer than 20 years ago. And I was very struck when I went over first to see all the European Parliament buildings and the Commission buildings. But what really struck me was all these huge buildings around. And when I began looking at the nameplates, these buildings are housing global law firms and global lobbying firms. And over the last certainly 20 years, I have seen democracy completely eroded. And the people that are running the show are these large office blocks that surround the European Parliament and the European Commission. And this is the beginning and the end of the problem. If you look at the ISDS, I think Attractim gave a couple of examples. Another example which is really we should be thinking about it in Ireland, it's to do with fracking. In Canada at the moment, there's a company suing the Canadian state for $250 million because they stopped the fracking in Quebec pending an analysis of, is it harmful or is it good? So I see this whole CETA as the icing on the cake for globalization. And as a business person, it's very important that we differentiate between globalization and doing business. Globalization, in my view, where you have these large global corporates taking it's a cancer. It's bad for people, it's bad for citizens, it's bad for SMEs and for farmers, and it's good for global corporations. And we have not been given access. This is the really maddening thing about it. We in this country in Ireland, we have our own representatives over in Brussels. We have representatives from Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, the established parties. They won't even sit down and discuss, and they won't tell the people what these deals are about. So don't get me wrong again, I'm all for trade, but not for CETA, because CETA is just a backdoor into further globalization. And look, as far as I can see, these people would like us all to be working in call centres.
Okay.
SMEs are going to be, there's going to be no SMEs. Farmers are being turned into serfs, right. And it's all to do with globalisation.
Okay, Seamus, we'll touch and come back to some of those points, and thank you. Patrick, you are the president of the ICSA, that's the body that represents beef and sheep farmers. Can you tell me what effect is CETA going to have on farming in this country if it's ratified?
Anna, thanks very much for this opportunity to speak here, and it could have very devastating effects. The scale and size of Canada, and it's just part of the North American bloc, and with NAFTA, it is, Mexico, United States and Canada are all the one when it comes to meat and feed, and they can, shuttle across the borders there, and there's a very long border between Canada and the US. And with the slight demise on TTIP, I see CETA as just a backdoor of TTIP. It's just TTIP at a backdoor, essentially. The food standards, the scale of farming there is vast. It takes more than a week to travel continuously by train from one border dealer in Canada at a standard speed. And I've been there, I've travelled across Canada, and I have relations there. I have relations farming there. And Canadian farmers are very, very efficient, but they're also very, very large scale. The actual size of farms there, the average farm size in Europe, for instance, 16 hectares. And in Canada, it's over 400 hectares, which is over 1,000 acres. And that, doesn't give a true reflection of the actual size in that more than half of the food is produced on 5% of the farms there. So some of those farms are many, many, many thousands of acres. And some of the fields are so big, actually, you can see the curvature of the earth there in that northern Alberta in particular comes to mind. And to expect European farmers to compete with farmers in Canada who are producing meat and other products, agricultural products, using high concentrations of chemicals and genetically modified ingredients in ractopamine in pork and lots of antibiotics, because of the scale, they just, they include a lot of these in feed because the animal issues are the concentration of animals there is very, very big, very large CAFOs, which is concentrated animal feedlots. And so the resultant meat is of a lower quality, a lower grade that the European consumer does not want. They want a higher quality food and are prepared to pay a little bit more for it. But the Canadians see us as the Mecca because we were getting about €1 a kilo roughly extra for our meat in Europe over the price in Canada. But they want to get in here and want to use the ISDS or the court mechanisms to force their way in if they can get this CETA deal through. And with the result that there will be a massive, not alone job losses along farming, but they reckon there's at least 220,000 jobs at stake here in Europe if the CETA deal goes through. So we can't compete on scale, but we can compete on quality here in Europe. And I think our marketing here in Ireland in particular, we export 90% of our beef and lamb out of this country, and our marketing is very, very suspect. I would have very big criticisms of Origin Green and issues like that, which are basically on carbon. It's not on the purity of our food and the health of our citizens. And bringing in an extra 60,000 tonnes extra of beef will come in, for instance, in the first year, and something more than that of pork. Pork is very, very vulnerable. The pig producers are very, very vulnerable here. There's also 100,000 tonnes of wheat coming in, which is considerable, a lot more than is coming in at the present. And both our tillage, pig and beef farmers will be put at great risk. The carrot on the stick is that we may get in some cheeses into Canada, but the type of cheese we produce now is very, very similar to American cheeses, so there really isn't a market for it there. We don't have the niche Italian and Dutch cheeses that they want. So it may, the Dutch and the Italian dairy farmers may benefit, but Irish dairy farmers will certainly not, in my opinion.
Okay.
We've got to resist this deal. This is a deal. This is TTIP by the back door. It empowers these large corporate firms. The meat industry, as I said, it's not a Canadian meat industry we're dealing with. It is JBS, which cover both South America and North America, the largest meat company in the world. That's just one of them that will be pushing in their product here through possibly burger giants like McDonald's or Burger King or so on and so forth. The mechanism is there right through Europe, and they may not come into Ireland, but it'll affect our markets in Europe, and it'll affect food quality. It's a dumbing down of standards. We've already dumbed down our standards here. We're now allowed to use lactic acid to wash carcasses here, which wasn't previously allowed, whereas they use chlorine in the States and so on. So really, human health is at stake here. Like, we have rising levels of cancer, obesity, diabetes. All these things are rising at a rapid level, almost approaching the American levels. And there's a massive big pharma link with the big chemical and big agrochemical businesses. So we've got to resist this deal. Simple as that.
Okay, this is truly shocking. Now, we heard Frank Hogan in the introduction speak on behalf of the Congress of Trade Unions, which represents almost 1 million workers, and Congress has come out very strongly against this deal. What I'm picking up from you is that this trade deal has been negotiated in secret. Now, I did fail in my efforts to have somebody representing the government to come and speak, because they are pushing for it. The Taoiseach and the Trade Minister, Charlie Flanagan, have signed off on this deal. Why is the government so reluctant to come out and debate and discuss this issue in public?
Just to correct the record, I suppose it's Mary Mitchell O'Connor, my local Fine Gael TD, who was unfortunately leading the charge, and it was before her was Richard Bruton. And not only are they keeping any sort of debate from happening on this issue, but they're actively lobbying for this deal, and actively lobbying to ensure that we can even try and get the ICS mechanism and court put in Ireland to bring more jobs. So it is a great question, but the answer is probably not on this panel of why the government are not putting forward any sort of debate and any rigorous consultation. And maybe it goes to the heart of what Patrick has said. It is because this is following on the EU's agenda to take powers from us as citizens, to erode democracy, and to hand over those powers to corporate bodies.
Seamus, you want to come in there?
I did. I just wanted to come in on what Patrick said, but just before that, in relation to the government. I mean, successive governments, for whatever reason, have sold themselves out to the body corporate. Nobody can understand this. I mean, our government won't even enforce basic competition laws in this country. Our government sides with large corporations, protects large corporations all the time at citizens' and SME expense. But I'm going to tell you the most important thing nearly that has been said. It's what Patrick said about healthy food. Ireland is never going to compete with Brazil and Argentina and Canada and America in relation to agricultural produce. So the only thing we have is our healthy food. We must ensure that we bring in no GMOs. We must keep GMOs out. The only way we can ever market our food, we're a tiny country with a tiny amount of produce, is to be the best. So we mustn't fall for this trade agreement where we'll be literally wiped out, sucked in by everybody else. We have got to make sure that there's no genetically modified foods, seeds, anything comes into this country. In a way, it's getting too late to do it. If we do that, we will have purchasers of our foods and all our agricultural products all over the world, and they'll pay premium rates.
Right.
So we must do that.
A tractor.
Just picking up on a couple of the points that have been made, I think it's actually really interesting that some of our MEPs have done an absolutely phenomenal job. And just this week, the Employment Committee in the EU voted an opinion to reject the CETA because of the concerns that it would actually have about employment. So quite contrary to the messages that we're getting from our own government. And if we actually think about SMEs, basically there are 90 million jobs across the EU that are created within SMEs. That is about 67% of total employment within the EU. And another figure and another statistic that opinion quoted was that 93% of those have less than 10 employees. And of the 20.9 million, sorry about the ream of statistics, but they're interesting figures, 20.9 million SMEs, only about 610,000 of those currently export outside of the EU. So what we're going to actually have is exactly as Patrick has outlined, is this massive imbalance of these much bigger scale organisations being able to drown out and compete, given different standards, given different economies of scale, with our own small, medium enterprises right across the EU. And there are various studies that indicate that the net effects on this will be quite negative in terms of the equality in wage income ratios and overall job losses. There will be some winners, but there will also be significant losers. And as with many of these things, the fat cats will get fatter and the rest of us will get leaner. And that's, I suppose, one of the big things that came across in one of the discussions I had with the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Employment, Minister Mary Mitchell O'Connor's own department, because they see it's important that Irish businesses will be able to use the ICS mechanism and sue in Canada. So they're prioritising the interests of a few small, big Irish businesses and leaving the whole Irish state and you and me as taxpayers exposed to a massive financial bill associated with the exposure to being sued, because we in Ireland have a massive level of foreign direct investment. So it's big business interests that are driving this and that appear to be driving our government in terms of, its views on this. And just to pick it up in the context of farming, and to sort of further elaborate on a point that Patrick was making there earlier, 5% of Canadian farmers following NAFTA are now responsible for nearly half of their food production. So you're talking about massive operators. And that massive operators, in terms of thinking about those field systems that show the curvature of the earth, think about what that's going to do to our landscape as the big farmers get bigger. Our small farmers get more and more crowded out. As it is, a huge amount of our farmers are uneconomic and require significant subsidies in order to be able to continue any sort of a livelihood on the land. But that is going to have a huge impact on rural Ireland in terms of the very fabric of our society, in terms of the way we know our communities are centred around farming in Ireland, and our tourism industry, which is also responsible for hundreds of thousands of jobs, both directly and indirectly, because of the quality and the beauty of our landscape and that patchwork system of fields, which stands to be eroded and devastated as the pressure for industrialisation. I absolutely empathise with business like Seamus. I've been an economic migrant myself. I know what it's like to be struggling and trying to, make a livelihood here in Ireland and to be forced to emigrate. But the reality is we have to balance the interests of all of our citizens, and it's not a case of trade is good or trade is bad, but it's no thank you to trade at any price. And the price with the CETA at the moment is just far too high.
Right, Director. Just at this juncture, I'd like to turn to the audience. We have Vincent Roddy, who is the chairperson of the Irish Natura and Hill Farmers Association. Vincent, you've been listening to what the panel have been saying. What are your views on CETA?
Thanks. I suppose, firstly, just as regards the whole aspect of trade, I hear what Seamus is saying, commend them on the work they've done as regards building bridges and getting trade into Canada and right around the world. And we do need trade, there's no doubt about that. But I think the CETA deal is going to see, as Patrick has said, a large influx, 70,000 kilos of 70 million kilos of beef into Ireland, and that in itself is going to have a massive effect, not into Ireland, across Europe. So that's going to have an impact on Irish farmers, obviously, and European farmers. But the other thing as well that springs to mind, and I was listening to Seamus and Patrick talking there, Seamus made, this whole idea of the kind of food that we want to eat and the idea that multinationals can, through this mechanism that is there, possibly force Europe and European farmers to take on board GMO food and also growth hormones, which presently do not exist in Europe, or it's not in European food. So I think, you know, if that food which is going to come in is there, and then, you know, farmers, whether it be in Ireland or in Germany or wherever in Europe, feel that they are going to have to compete because it will open the door to further trade deals, no doubt about that, then there is a genuine concern there, and I have a genuine concern that we are going to see GMO food being produced in Europe. We are going to see growth hormones in beef cattle being reintroduced, and I don't think that's good for Irish consumers or for European consumers, because I think the food we have is much better than what we have anywhere else.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I have to confess that I never heard of CETA until possibly about 6 weeks ago. Hence, I'm not up to speed even in naming the Trade Minister. And I think that, you know, I'm not alone. I think the vast majority of people in Ireland haven't a clue what CETA is about. And, you know, it's getting pretty serious because it's coming up for ratification in the EU Parliament shortly after Christmas, and it will be coming before the Dáil possibly in February for ratification. Where do we go from here in making people more aware of what's happening?
Well, I don't know exactly about that, Anna, but listening to the other members of the panel here, I feel I'm the piggy in the middle, because it's the most dystopian thing. You know, it's going to be, you know, fire and brimstone is going to come on us with the CETA. I think it's an overreaction. And I think certainly we do have superior beef than nearly anywhere in Europe, never mind with the Canadians. And if they're going to swamp us with all this rubbish, we're quids in. We go over to Canada and sell a premium product. Now, what we want to do is face up to it and see and box clever, because I think this is coming down the line, and I think it's going to be ratified, because I think Fine Gael are in favour of it, and they're the majority. My own party, you know, I would like to hear a lot of debate. Never have I heard it discussed at a Fianna Fáil meeting. And I would re-echo exactly what you said in that respect. The vast majority of people don't even know what CETA is or anything like that. But, you know, in business and in other walks of life, you have to change and you have to adapt and you have to meet challenges. And, you know, if it's going to come, whether we like it or not, then we must adapt and make the best of it. And, you know, I believe the Canadians have at least a long life as we have. So if they're eating all this rubbish, and all of this thing, why aren't they dropping like flies? They're not, you know. So all these scaremongering and all of this will get us nowhere, you know. And I think it's a bit rich of Sinn Féin giving us a lecture on courts. You know, that's not on. I do loathe the multinationals and the power they have, but that's there already in the EU. We're fighting that, and we have been fighting that, and we'll fight the Canadians too, and we'll win.
Well, this just on that point, and it's not a case of fighting or dystopian hell and brimstone. It's facts. It's facts, and a number of comparative studies have been done on the impacts of specifically CETA. And I must say, I commend you for taking part in this panel tonight. You know, not knowing that you were going to do so, and also with no knowledge of CETA in a personal capacity as a local councillor, or even I must say it's quite surprising to hear that no discussion has taken place within Fianna Fáil on this issue.
I'm talking about locally now.
Yeah, but on such a serious issue that will affect every community right across this island. You know, that is surprising. But on the issue of trade, Ireland has signed up to over 1,000 bilateral trade agreements. It's with countries right across the world, right across the globe. And in any of those trade agreements, there is no inclusion of an ISDS or ICS measure because it is not needed. We do not need to hand over further powers to corporations at the expense of our citizens and human rights.
Here.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that's one of the things that's quite unique about Ireland in an EU context, because a lot of the other member states have actually entered into these investment arbitration systems in bilateral trade agreements that they've had. We've only got one, which is the Energy Charter Treaty. But because, as I said earlier, we have this massive level of foreign direct investment, we actually prove the point. You don't need to concede to these mechanisms in order to be able to attract foreign direct investment in. But if we do, we actually stand massively exposed. And I think why this session tonight is really, really important is because of, exactly as you've said, Anna, just the lack of awareness, the lack of debate. And this really needs to be a big wake-up call. Because actually, had the Trade Committee in the EU Parliament and the President of the Parliament had their way, a vote would have already taken place in the EU Parliament this December without facilitating any of the other committees being able to give an opinion to inform the plenary of the Parliament before they actually made a decision. But there was a massive backlash, outcry from a lot of sort of citizens, civil society-based organisations and a number of very active MEPs to highlight the fact that this was unacceptable. So there's been some tokenistic and cosmetic concession given the Christmas break that some additional committees will be allowed, create very rushed opinions. They won't be able to have the extensive hearings, debate and discussion that they had wanted. And a vote is going to go before the Parliament in February. Now, what's critical about that is everybody's saying, OK, well, down the road, we're going to have a vote in our own Parliament, whenever that's going to be. But what will follow from the European Parliament's vote is a thing called provisional application. And this is where some of the elements of the agreement come into effect before it is finally concluded. That means before the other member states actually get to vote on it and ratify it in their own parliaments. And a lot of the elements of the agreement that we're concerned about will actually come in via provisional application. Not the investor court system. There's been a decision that it's too hot a potato to include in that. And that should tell us something. You know, that should actually give us a warning that they're keeping the worst to last. But the issue is that a lot of the elements that will come in will still have, exactly as Seamus was alluding to earlier, that regulatory chilling effect, which will compromise the ability and the appetite of our governments and the EU for progressive legislation in our citizens' interests. Okay. So this is a real and present danger. This is a trade deal with a difference. This is not known as a new generation trade deal for no reason. This is going to change every aspect of the way we live, work, play and die.
Right. Okay. So finally, I intend sending a copy of this documentary to Enda Kenny along with the letter. So, to sum up, I am going to ask each of you, what are you going to say to Enda Kenny? I'll begin with you, Patrick. What have you to say to Enda Kenny?
Well, I would certainly ask Enda Kenny to consider this. You know, like there is a term known about politicians, they suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect. And that means that they know so little, they don't realise how little they know. And I think this applies to CETA very, very much. And it's got to be studied. And copies of this agreement, even if it is that long, has got to be given to each politician and TD in the country. And they should be made to actually read right through it until they understand it in full.
Okay.
And I think that's imperative. Also, getting back to Seamus' point about business and transnational and so on and so forth, you know, small and medium businesses, which this country is full of, and it's very, very important to keep those businesses sustainable. But with CETA, a lot of these businesses, you know, small and medium means less than 3 million per annum turnover. A lot of these will be wiped. They will actually be wiped because of globalization and the big conglomerates and so on and so forth. So I think it's imperative that they are protected, those small businesses are protected. And farming is on the brink at the minute. A lot of dry stock farmers are, you know, they're not bringing in the successor because it's not possible to bring somebody in there. The incomes are below the level of the dog. And the next step is just, you know, they'll be shutting the gate. And if this is brought through with cheap food coming in from the Canadian-American bloc, cheap, low-quality food, the health of our citizens is at risk here in Europe, but also the farmers' livelihoods, and it will decimate rural Ireland.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Seamus, what have you to say briefly to Enda Kenny?
To Taoiseach Kenny, well, I would say first and foremost that our group have corresponded and sent in reports and all kinds of research over the last 5-6 years. 64 different documents, and we have never received a response, good, bad and indifferent, from Mr. Enda Kenny or any of his ministers. I think Taoiseach Kenny needs to look at the motor vehicle sector, he needs to look at the agri sector, he needs to look at the oil and gas sector, he needs to look at the fishing sector. We've got serious problems, and in our view, the way out of all these problems is to drive the indigenous economy, and we can do it. We need to bring in community banking and public banking. We need to put our heads around a table. The government is obsessed with FDI and tax havens and all the rest. We've got to move on from there, and we've got to sit down and have a serious conversation about CETA.
Okay, thank you, Seamus. Shane, what have you to say to Enda Kenny?
Just one thing. I would call on Enda Kenny, through his Minister, Mary Mitchell O'Connor, not to ratify this deal in her role and the EU Council of Ministers, to initiate a full and open debate, as my colleagues in the Oireachtas have called for, and to actually, before any further steps are taken, that we actually take time, create the political space to go through the 30 chapters contained in the 1,500 pages in detail and look at them on a sector-by-sector basis. And I believe when that debate happens and that analysis happens, it will be completely and obvious that this deal represents a bad deal for Ireland. So I would call on Enda Kenny, through his Minister, not to ratify this deal.
Thank you, Shane. Seamus, what have you to say to Enda Kenny?
Well, first of all, I'd say to Enda Kenny is we have quotas, on gender and things like that in parties, and we know all about that in Longford. Is there are not enough people in business involved in politics locally or nationally with business experience. And what I'd say to Enda Kenny is go and consult the business, the Irish indigenous businesses, and see how they can make the best out of this deal if you're pushing it forward, and take out the nasties if you can. There are obviously things. I do have a problem with multinationals and their powers. I'm an SME ourselves, and I'd say to them, listen, consult and educate, because I think when the people hear a lot about this, but I mean, we want to see the positives, and there are positives. For Irish companies, I can see, for example, burgeoning craft cheese industry can go out to Canada, because most of their cheese is very bland. You'd never order a cheese plate in Canada. Okay.
Right, thank you, Seamus. And finally, a tractor. What have you to say to Enda Kenny?
I probably should ask Enda Kenny and Santa, because I have a long list. I'd like to pick up on a lot of the things that have already been asked for, if I may, but I think what is absolutely critical is that Enda Kenny needs to engage immediately with the Fine Gael MEPs representing us over in Brussels in the lead up to this vote in the Parliament, and engage with them in a way in which they engage with their party colleagues at an EU level, because the vote in February is absolutely going to be critical in terms of bringing an effect of this agreement into effect already. And without proper debate, meaningful debate and balanced debate, we shouldn't be making those decisions. We are owed a duty to make informed decisions from our politicians. And there has been absolutely no proper disclosure on this. We haven't seen the facts and the figures. We haven't seen any level of consultation in terms of what sectors have been protected, what sectors haven't been protected and why. And we haven't seen the government's view of why this doesn't conflict with our constitution. Okay. And we need all of that information before we take the next step, let alone any step that may or may not come before our Parliament. Because until the Court of Justice rules in another very important trade deal, which is the Singapore trade deal, which will give us some answers in relation to how this agreement will actually be concluded, we can't be 100% certain that our Parliament will have the right to ratify that. And I think that's actually quite critical, and I think there is an onus of responsibility on Enda Kenny, and I wish to say quite formally I am appalled at the level and lack of engagement that there has been on this, and how this government went ahead at Halloween, the worst Halloween ever, and signed that agreement and gave the authority to the EU to do so without engaging in a proper, public, meaningful debate and within our Parliament on it. For shame in the year 2016.
Okay, and I think on that note, we'll finish. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you, Tractor, Seamus, Shane, Seamus and Patrick, for travelling all the way to Longford to take part in this discussion. And I know that you've come long distances, so it's very much appreciated. To you, the audience at home, thank you very much for watching. I hope you're better informed now about CETA. We started off by asking the question, CETA, what's the big deal? I think, having listened to our panel tonight, we know that it is a big deal. Until we meet again, Bannock Day or If Golair.